Hello painters, welcome back to the channel. In today's video I'll be painting a Tomb Banshee from start to finish. We will see each step from the first base coat to the final highlights, sharing tips and techniques to achieve a clean tabletop result. If you enjoy miniature painting content and want to see more tutorials and time lapses like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support the video. Let's get started. The step is done using Wine Red by AK. I usually begin with a black primer, followed by a white zenithal highlight from above. These help me establish the volume right from the start and give me a clear guide for light and shadow before I even begin applying color. Once the priming is complete, I move on to laying down my darkest base tone. In this case, to paint the robe of the Tomb Banshee, I choose the Wine Red. It's a red that doesn't lean too heavily toward brown, which makes it perfect for creating smooth and pleasing color transition as we start building up the highlights later on. As you can see, I always try to apply at least 2 thin coats even for the base layers. Working with thin layers helps prevent the paint from becoming too thick or grainy on the surface. Of course, this approach takes a little more time since the first coat won't be fully opaque, but the smoother finish is absolutely worth in the end. For the second step, I start building up the highlights on the robe using Carmine Red from AK. This color is slightly brighter and more vibrant, which makes it perfect for defining the raised areas and enhancing the volumes we established early with the zenithal priming. Just like before, I work with multiple thin layers. Instead of blending the paint in a traditional way, I rely on the opacity of the color itself. By gradually layering thin coats, I can create a smooth transition without spending too much time on complex wet blending or glazing. This approach allows me to achieve quick controller gradients that are ideal for a solid tabletop standard. It's efficient, clean, and still gives the miniature a strong sense of depth and contrast. For the third step, I used Scarlet Red to push the strongest highlights on the robe and really define the sharpest fold. I keep the paint very thin, almost like a glaze, so it gently builds over the previous layers without leaving harsh edges. Once I'm happy with the intensity, I mix in a small amount of deep orange to the Scarlet Red. With this slightly warmer and brighter tone, I carefully pick out only the very highest point where the light will hit the most. This is the final touch to add extra vibrancy and make the highlight pop, giving the robe the more dynamic and luminous finish. For the bones, I start with dark brown that gives me a strong foundation and helps me define all the recessed areas right from the beginning. Next, I layer British Khaki, leaving the dark brown visible in the deepest part to preserve the shadows. I apply it with thin controlled coat to gradually build opacity. For the third step, I mix British Khaki with a bit of Ivory to start creating the main highlights. This lighter mix is applied to the raised surfaces and edges, enhancing the structure of the bones. Finally, I use a small touch of pure Ivory on the very tips and sharpest edge to create crisp final highlights and really make the details stand out. For the hair, I start by covering everything with a solid coat of black. This gives me a deep, rich base and creates an immediate strong contrast with the red robe. Once the black is fully dry, I begin building subtle highlights by mixing in a small amount of dark blue-gray. I carefully apply this mix to the raised strands and the most exposed area, keeping the transition soft and controlled. The goal here isn't to make the hair look grey, but simply to introduce a cool tone that adds depth and texture. For the final highlights, I create a lighter mix using black, dark blue-gray and a touch of white. With this combination, I gently pick out the sharpest strands and the uppermost areas to simulate light catching the air. The deep black creates a strong visual contrast with the robe and, as we will see shortly, it will also work beautifully against the ethereal blue glow of the sword, enhancing the overall composition of the miniature. I move on to the white parts of the dress. White is always a challenging color to paint, and it's important not to start directly with pure white, otherwise the result can look flat and chalky. I begin with a base coat of Gargoyle Grey from Army Painter to establish the volumes and create a solid foundation. Then I build the highlights using Brainmatter Grey from Army Painter, applying thin layers on the raised fold while keeping the shadow visible. To push the brightest areas, I gradually mix some white into the Brainmatter Grey, and finally I add very light touches of pure white on the sharpest point. This method helps avoid a grainy finish. A small tip: Kimera white works particularly well because it stays smooth and less chalky compared to many other brands. For the gold areas, I work in 3 main steps. I start with Wool Red from AK as a base. This gives me rich shadows and helps set up the structure for a non-metallic metal effect. Next, I apply Sahara Yellow. At this stage it often doesn't look like a metallic yet, and that's completely normal. The surface may appear flat or unfinished. For me, the real magic happens in the final step. I mix a bit of ice yellow into the Sahara and use it for sharp edge highlights and small point of light. That's what really creates the illusion of a reflective gold and makes the effect come to life. Now we move on to the sword. Here I wanted to create an ethereal effect, almost ghostly, and I decided to invert the usual lighting. Instead of placing the brightest highlights toward the tip, I concentrated the light closer to the hilt, as if the energy was flowing outward from the grip. I started by painting the entire blade white. This gives maximum brightness and helps the color really pop. Over that I applied Hydra Turquoise from Army Painter as the main tone. Then I mixed in a bit of white, and using thin glaze layers I softened the transition back toward the poor white areas. To finish, I added a few subtle streaks along the blade to suggest movement, almost like a trapped soul swirling inside. The goal was to keep the effect very subtle, but still dynamic and atmospheric. The next part, you can see the non-metallic metal effect on the hilt and the jewels. As said previously, I started with Wool Red, then Sahara Yellow, and finally a bit touch of ice yellow mixed to create sharp highlights and bring out the reflective details. For the gems, I wanted them to appear blue, so I started with a black base, then layered the Russian blue light and finished with a small touch of Ducat Blue. To make the gem sparkle, I added a tiny dot of white on the highest point to simulate that reflective shine. For the base, I applied Vallejo Heavy Siena, followed by a airbrush of XV88 and finished with a light airbrush of Tyrant Skull to bring out all the texture details. And that's it for this miniature. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the process, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more painting time lapses and tutorial. Happy painting!